Greetings to you all. So let's begin with a polite little reminder about your homework, such as it is. So you should be reading Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Okay, that's what you should be getting on with. And again, I'm not asking you to read chapter 5 unless you particularly want to. You might pick up some bonus marks in your midterm if you do, but it's quite philosophical and you might say dry, chapter 5, so you don't need to go there, all right, unless you really want to. So I guess we're going to get there not in the next video, but in the video after that. And of course there will be a quiz that I'll send out to you when we get to it. And the quiz will be very simple, mostly one-word answers, showing me that you've read the thing, okay? So there's nothing to worry about at all. Should be easy, but at least get going with that, okay? And I guess it's a good idea to remind ourselves where we are with these videos. We have been looking at primarily amygdalal memory states and how they are represented in certain forms of literature. So we've been looking at romanticism and then symbolism. And let's remind ourselves how we can distinguish these two treatments of amygdalal emotional memory. In the case of the romantics, I think what we have is an event which triggers an intense emotion. And the route back to that for romantics tends to be abstract and emotional. So it's the subsequent experiencing of the emotion which takes the subject back to the memory of the event itself. And of course we've talked about this, right? So it's Rousseau's feeling guilt or injustice that takes him back. It's Lamartine feeling love that takes him back to that moment. You know, my experience of embarrassment that takes me back to that episode with the cell phone. And I guess the trigger in this case can be chance. It can be accidental. Just you see something that makes you feel injustice or hear about something that makes you feel injustice and bang, there you go back to that memory. Or I think for romantics like Wordsworth and Victor Hugo and a few others, it's more meditative and contemplative. You just get yourself into that sort of state, and that's how you can find the emotion that will take you back. We can contrast this with the symbolist approach, where I think it's not so much an event as an encounter or an actual experience in a more sort of focused way, and the route back, which triggers emotions, right? And the route back is going to be sensory and emotional, and the trigger there could be accidental. Again, it could be that you just happen to smell a perfume which reminds you of that person who wore the same perfume, so it could be that. It could be just accidental, or it could be sought out in the way that we looked at with Baudelaire, where you seek out the trigger voluntarily so that it can act as a vehicle to take you back to the original place. Right, so what we're going to do in this video is explore symbolism a bit more. This time in the form of a short story. And then towards the end, we'll move into further analysis of symbolism and explore how that is developed by Proust, and in a way that also can connect with the hippocampal, more episodic memory process that forms the next stage in our course. Okay, so that's kind of what we're doing today. And our focus, main focus today, is on a story by Edgar Allan Poe called A Telltale Heart, which I want you to read, right? So as if in the classroom, I would actually ask the students now to read the story. That's what I want you to do now, please. And it should take no more than 10-15 minutes, so please do that and then come back here. All right, so now, assuming that you have read the story, there are a couple of things I want to talk about by way of preamble before we start to look at the symbolism of the story. So the first thing is a lot to do with why I've chosen Poe. Poe is really important in the history of literature, insofar as he is really the first author to not just write short stories, but to explain them, to actually provide a theory, a rationale for the writing of short tales, prose tales, or short stories as we would call them. So that's the first thing I want to look at, and there's a very interesting essay. Firstly, let's have a look at the man himself. Isn't that just a fabulous photograph? Which pretty much says all you need to know about him. His fascinations and obsessions. Okay, so here's the essay, which he came up with in 1842. That's when it was published. The importance of the single effect in a prose tale. I'm not going to read this word for word, but just look at what he's saying here at the beginning. The tale or story proper, in our opinion, affords unquestionably the fairest field for the exercise of the loftiest talent, which can be afforded by the wide domains of mere prose. Were we bidden or asked to say how the highest genius could be most advantageously employed for the best display of its own powers, we should answer without hesitation in the composition of a rhymed poem, not to exceed in length what might be perused in an hour. Within this limit alone can the highest order of true poetry exist, and we need only here say upon this topic that in almost all classes of composition, the unity of effect or impression is point of the greatest importance. Now, top of the next page. Were we called upon, however, to designate that class of composition which, next to such a poem as we've suggested, should best fulfill the demands of high genius, should offer it the most advantageous field of exertion, we should unhesitatingly speak of the prose tale. And so we allude to the short prose narrative, the short story, requiring from a half hour to 1 or 2 hours in its perusal. Reading is the word. The ordinary novel is objectionable from its length, for reasons stated in substance, as it cannot be read at one sitting. It deprives itself, of course, of the immense force derivable from totality, worldly interests intervening during the pauses of perusal modify, annul, or counteract in a greater or less degree the impression of the book. But simple cessation in reading, or stopping altogether, would of itself be sufficient to destroy the true unity. In the brief tale, however, the author is enabled to carry out the fullness of his intention, be it what it may. And during the hour of reading, perusal, the soul of the reader is at the writer's control. There are no external or extrinsic influences resulting from weariness or interruption. Okay. The next bit is useful, I think, to any of you who are creative writers. Just look at what he says here. So, a skillful literary artist has constructed a story, a tale. If wise, he has not fashioned his thoughts to accommodate his incidents, but having conceived with deliberate care a certain unique or single effect to be wrought out, to be created, he then invents such incidents. And he then combines such events as may best aid him in establishing this preconceived effect. So in other words, don't start with the plot. What you start with is what effect do I want to have on the reader when they read my story. Once you've figured out that as your main objective, you then ask yourself, well, okay, well, how do I achieve that? And that's when you start building plot and character and so on. Look at this. If his very initial sentence tend not to the outbringing of this effect, then he has failed in his first step. In the whole composition, there should be no word written of which the tendency, direct or indirect, is not to the one pre-established design. And by such means, with such care and skill, a picture is at length painted which leaves in the mind of him who contemplates it with a kindred art a sense of the fullest satisfaction. The idea of the tale has been presented unblemished, because undisturbed. And this is an end unattainable by the novel. Undue brevity is just as acceptable here as in the poem, but undue length is yet more to be avoided. And then finally here, in this bottom of the page, he basically sets up the idea that the idea of the beautiful, the best vehicle for that, for attaining the beautiful, at least in writing, is the poem. But truth is often, and in very great degree, the aim of the story. And that's something that he works on in other essays and explanations. There's one in particular called The Philosophy of Composition, in which he repeats that point, that beauty is the object of the rhymed poem, but reality or truth, I think reality is what he means by truth, is serviced far more appropriately by prose narrative and by the short story. And there's something else he says in this other essay, which I referred to, the Philosophy of Composition, which is to do with morality. A lot of people, when they read Poe's stories, are sort of horrified by, the imagery, the appalling imagery at times. It's almost as though all his characters are manifestations of twisted, effed up evil behavior, with weird obsessions, whether it be necrophilia or whatever, So, and the effect is, this is horrible. But I think Poe's point is that it is not the point of fiction, of stories, to be preaching, to be dealing with morality. They are, for him, by definition, amoral. Poe, I think, when you read about him, seems to accept that there is a morality. He seems to accept that there is a God. People argue about this, but it's not as though we have an immoral or amoral author. What we have, and it's set out quite clearly in this essay, the second one I've referred to, is an author who just thinks it's not the business of writers to be preaching. Rather, the point of a story is to excite and to titillate. And Poe does this by teasing at the senses, by appealing to our prurient appetites. Titillation, I think, is a good word here. I think this is what he's all about here. He's very mischievous and very playful. And I think that it helps to kind of read his stories with that kind of an understanding and a screen, so you kind of really know what he's about. All right, so that's kind of the first thing I wanted to say by way of preamble. Let's have another look at him. Oh, yeah, there he is. And then we move to the story, A Telltale Heart. So there are lots of different interpretations of this story. Of course there are, you can well imagine that. Many tend to focus on the theme of sanity or insanity in the narrator of this story. Excuse me. So that in some cases the I, the old man's I, is taken to phonetically suggest the first person I. And that then suggests a reading of schizophrenia, that the narrator is the old man. It's just different facets of the same personality. So, you can do a very interesting psychoanalytical reading of this story by exploring schizophrenia if you want to. You could also look at this in terms of Karl Jasper's distinction between primary and secondary delusion. So this, of course, can be quite complex, and you can explore this in your own time if you choose to do so. But in essence, the primary delusion is in the subjects that you just can't understand what they're saying. It's just not in any way explicable. One of Jasper's patients, I think, had the belief that she was Mary, Queen of Scots. At the same time, she seemed to understand that Mary, Queen of Scots was executed in the mid-16th century. But that did not preclude her from stating and behaving and being her. And this is an example of a primary delusion because it just doesn't make any bloody sense, right? You just can't get into this and understand it in any shape or form. But a secondary delusion is behavior which you can start, a delusion which you can start to unpack and explain and understand if you take into account other maybe psychopathological inputs. So it may be that the subject is stating what they're stating in a state of hallucination or inebriation or abnormal mood. And it may be also constructive to feed in sociological background, family, whatever. And suddenly you might have a delusional statement which you can start to unpack and explain. And so in that sense, we have that distinction between primary and secondary. And that might be a useful way to enter this story, right? And to start unpacking what's going on here with the narrator. Another psychoanalytical approach that occurs to me is to do with Jacques Lacan. He was a student of Freud, but profoundly develops Freudian principles. Lacan had this notion of the mirror stage in a child's psychosexual development, which is that moment where the child sees itself in a mirror for the first time, or for the first time in a way that it becomes aware of itself as object, body, external from its self. There it is, there, and I lift my arm and this does that, and it does that. And this can be a fascinating moment for a child, but also an extremely disturbing one. And it's a moment that never leaves us, according to Lacan. We keep going through the mirror stage and dealing with it the older we get. And it is this disconcerting realization that the object image in front of us in the mirror does not conform to that ideal object image we have of ourselves. Maybe you're familiar with that, or at least with the saying that you see a photograph of yourself and you're kind of shocked. That's not me. I never look good in photographs. I'm not photogenic. Well, maybe that is you. It's just not how you want to look. I can recall the personal experience of my mother telling me for the first time that I was going bald. It's like, what? You know, of course I'm not. And I look at the mirror. No, 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 of course not. No. I'm looking at the skull there. You know, eventually that's the mirror, right? That's what we look like. And you know, we can laugh at that or not, but it's something that also takes us to what Lacan talks about, and I think it's really relevant for this story. He talks about the real with a capital R. Of course, this is all in French, and the real is that horrific abyss, you know, beyond language. It's the ineffable. That's what ineffable means, which carries us into the mortality of our lives. It's that skeleton. It's that darkness inside of us all. It's suggested by Freud's notion of the uncanny, and it's also connecting with the death wish, which is kind of inside us all and which bubbles to the surface from time to time. And so this is all, I think, suggested in this story, and you could run a fabulous psychoanalytical reading of it in all these different directions. You could do a really good feminist reading of this story. What if you were to imagine the narrator as female? Why not? What is in the story to preclude us from doing that? To preclude that? And when you do that, the setting of the story becomes active and significant in a way that perhaps it wasn't for us the first time we read it, because we're talking about a bedroom now. And the I becomes that objectifying vehicle. The only way you can objectify anything, anyone, a body, is by looking at it, right? Or writing about looking at it. And that would be, I think, a very fruitful route of analysis if you wanted to explore a feminist reading of this story. You could even do a Marxist one. I mean, it's stretching it a bit, but if you're a committed cultural materialist, you'd find a way. You'd find a way. So what about if you had, the old man as employer and the narrator as employee, exploited worker under capitalist bourgeois arrangements suggested by the kind of furniture and the watch and stuff like this. So yeah, you might have the representation of a capitalist society with the policeman coming and the church clock, this sort of thing, and the narrator's breakdown, mental state, would be, I think, understood as some kind of Durkheimian anomie or, you know, exploitation, alienation, that sort of thing. All right, so you could run a Marxist interpretation if you wanted. All right, well, for us, like it or not, it's symbolist, because we're looking at memory and recall and how that's operating in this story. So how might we read this as a symbolist text? And I think here we need to understand that there's something very Baudelairean about what Poe is doing in this story. Because what we have is objects or events which conflate very quickly into a long and elaborate description of the effect of the event or object on the subject, on the person. That, I think, is key to what symbolist text does. And the event here, which is triggering the recall of the narrator, is the encounter with the object I of the old man. It's that object, the encounter with that object, which and the really highly wrought almost visceral disgust and repugnance that the narrator feels in encountering that object. This is what is creating the recall. Okay? And this is what characterizes the whole text in this sense as amygdala, because it's so highly wrought, hyperbolic, and emotional in its overall construction. I think as a bullet point that might help us here, symbolists do not depict the thing, but rather the effect it produces. Okay? So the emphasis is not so much on the thing or the object, but on the emotion or effect it produces. When Baudelaire is remembering the hair of his lover Jean Duval, it's not in the same way that you might remember or think about the hair of your relatives or colleagues or friends or whatever. For him, it's how it smelled that day. It's the texture of it that day after she'd had it cut, perhaps, or after she'd come out of the shower, and how damp it was, the smell of it, and the emotions that these little interactions had. This is how he remembers hair. Okay? So that's how I think we need to be sort of launching ourselves into this story. So let's bring it up, shall we? What effect is Poe trying to create here? And how does he achieve that in the first sentence? And then how does he achieve that in the first paragraph? That's the question we should be asking ourselves, bearing in mind the essay that we looked at, what he's all about as a writer, and how this is being read as a symbolist text. Look at the first word, true. And now nervous. Look at these dashes. Very, repeated, very, dreadfully nervous. I had been and am, semicolon. But why will you say that I am mad? What's he doing here? What's he doing to you, the reader? Well, I would venture to say, all I can really do is say what he's doing in me. I would venture to say that he's doing two things. Firstly, he's confusing me, and that's very deliberate. And secondly, he's provoking me. So let's look at the confusion. True, he says, with an exclamation mark. But what's true? What? How and what is true? I have no idea. And who says it's true? So I'm already confused. Yeah. Nervous. All right, very, very dreadfully nervous. Well, that you can see in the text with the repetition of the diction here. I had been and am, so now he's talking about something that was, but is at the same time. So there's a conflation of time there, which is a little bit difficult to comprehend. And now this. But why will you say that I am mad? Well, I didn't say, did I? When did I say that? And do I think that he is? I don't know yet. So, but why is he questioning me like this? But this is Poe. Poe's just playing games. He wants you hooked into this text. And he's now going to tease you and play with you, which he continues to do. So the disease he now refers to had sharpened my senses. Well, I don't know what disease he's talking about here. Maybe it's some kind of nervousness. Neurasthenia is what they used to call it back in his day. But I don't know what it is. But he says it's sharpened his senses, not destroyed or dulled them. So, and suddenly he's got a really acute sense of hearing. All right. So he's hearing all the things in the heaven and the earth, and he heard many things in hell. And I'm thinking, well, that sounds a bit, how then am I mad? Well, I'm thinking, well, I don't know. Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. But that's true, because he seems to be writing in a fairly organized way. I mean, this isn't just the ravings or scratched out disparate words. We have an organized text here. So, I don't know, I'm just kind of confused, perplexed, slightly intrigued, and involved. It's not like a flat once upon a time text, is it? It's like I'm in there somehow. I've got to sort this out. Now, one of the ways we can drill down on this to see the game that Poe is playing is to start thinking about semiotics and what he's doing here linguistically. And to do that, it's going to help us to go to Ferdinand de Saussure, who died in 1913, and he gives us a very helpful analysis or way of analyzing language and how words operate. So let's just have a look at that. Here we are. Semiotics, broadly speaking, about signs and signifiers, and symbols and how they are interpreted across cultures. What is a sign signifier? Well, a sign is the smallest unit of meaning, and you need a signifier and a signifier. So you can see these diagrams, and these are what are called Saussurean models. So the tree represents the concept of what we think about when we hear the word tree, which is the signified, and the actual sound or the actual appearance in print is the signifier. So if I say the word tree, that's the signifier to you. And the line between the signified and signifier represents the link the mind triggers whenever the two are placed together. And the arrows represent that constant interaction between concept and sound visual. So altogether, the signified and the signifier make up the sign of a tree and all of the cultural meanings we associate with the tree. Environmental issues, Christmas trees, rainforests, tree in the backyard, so on. And semiotics is used to inform the reader of what interpretation she should make in regards to the sign tree. And here we have this, what is my ultimate goal in a semiotic analysis? Well, it could be to create a link between the concept and the sound, and that will help you interpret the cultural and social meanings associated with the sign. And there you have an argument. I think it's going to help to take this one step further, as Saussure does, in a little sort of diagram that I've scribbled up here, because that takes us to the differential, which is important, I think. So look at the example we just had, the signifier, the actual sound of the word or sight of a tree. Now you have an image of a tree in your mind, which is my little squiggly thing. But there's the differential line. And so in our minds, in microseconds, when we picture that tree, we have a binary opposite, so of not tree. So that tree outside my window, or in my mind, is not a flower, it's not a bush, it's not a And so we can do this with every noun or abstract noun that we have. Disease here, and I've obviously picked these two words because of this first paragraph. Disease as a signified suggests something bad afflicting the body. Those medical students watching this video will be roaring with laughter at my simplistic signified. I apologize, but there it is. But then look at the binary opposite. It would be a healthy body, a body without disease. And then you can kind of break that down and differentiate more sort of forensically, it's not a wound, it's not a broken leg, it's not a running cold, blah, blah, blah. And now true, something which is verified, established, generally accepted, binary opposite, false, and the differential would be all these other things one might say. It's something true is not delusional, it's not deceitful, it's not misleading, it's not so on and so forth. So I think what Poe is doing here quite deliberately is teasing that line, that differential line, so that when he says the word true, we're actually not in a position to form the differential because we don't know what he's talking about. All right? And so it is with, oh bollocks, what have I just done? Let's bring it up. And so it is with the notion of disease. We are bereft of or without a reliable semiotic matrix. Or to put it another way, we have an unreliable signifying chain here, and it operates throughout the story. It's as though these signifiers are spinning off on their own trajectories and not conforming to how we normally and conveniently would like to understand these words. This is the game I think he's playing. And sort of linked to that is what happens in the next paragraph. Because he is playing with us by saying, well, I know you're going to try and explain my behavior. You're going to go off with Jaspers or Lacan or Freud. That's what you're going to do, right? You're just going to say that I'm mad, that I'm insane, and then you're going to try to categorize it as, primary, secondary, or whatever. But he says it's not so easy. It's impossible to say how this idea entered my brain. It haunted me, but there was no object to it. There was no passion. I loved the guy, right? I mean, he never wronged me, never insulted me, had no desire to steal from him. So, what's my motive? And that's the provocation here, because when we as rational readers read this story and consider this narrator, we think, oh, what a bad man. And we're immediately trying to rationalize and explain and define his type of behavior as insane, as irrational. And yet he's taking away all of those categories that would provide us with motive and intention. We have an intentionless crime here. And actually, I don't know how common law courts are equipped to deal with that. I don't think they are, because as a prosecutor in a criminal common law court, Canada, America, England, wherever, you're going to be looking for actus reus, the act was performed, and mens rea, the subject or defendant intended to perform the said act. There is intention which takes us to motive. Here, Poe is playing with us and saying, no motive. What are you going to do? So what was it all about? His eye, the look of the eye. Pale blue with a film over it. And there's the trigger. And you can see the effect of it, which is what the Symbolist project is all about, isn't it? His blood runs cold, and everything that follows is really a peroration or an elaboration of the effect of that sight on the narrator. And more specifically, it's going to become a soundscape, but we'll come to that in a moment. And here we are. Here's the narrator, the challenger, going, you fancy me mad, right? Madmen supposedly know nothing, but you should have seen me, and how wisely I proceeded, with what caution and foresight, how cleverly I covered up what I was doing, dissimulation. So I was kind to him, all the time, before I killed him. And this next passage here reminds me so much of Rousseau's Confessions, in the way that you have this really drawn out reenactment of the emotions that were bubbling at the time of the event. It's almost as though when Rousseau's, and he actually says, my hand is shaking as I'm writing down this memory of, my event with that comb or ribbon or whatever it was. And see here how in the repetitions of the text, I moved it slowly, this lantern, very, very slowly. Look what I'm doing with my hand here. How can I not? It's almost as though he's in the text and the repetition of the diction, reenacting like a child would what's actually happening in front of us. Ha, he says, would a madman have been so wise as this? And then when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked, just that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And he does this for 7 long nights. Right? I suppose we could do a biblical thing there too. But the eye was always closed. And note the contrast here, because we have day and night, or night and day. So everything has been at nighttime. And now, in the morning, when the day broke, I went boldly into his bedroom chamber and I spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone. So we're having this contrast in sound now between the stealthy, whispering, creaking, almost silent sounds, if that makes any sense, and now the kind of day-to-day clamoring sounds of the street. That's increasingly significant in this story, as we'll see. Eighth night, more than usually cautious. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. The reference to a watch is foreshadowing, of course, what happens. It takes us to this other important theme in the story, which is the passing of time. And indeed, that may take us, and will take us shortly, to Poe's own fascination with mortality and the passing of time. And heightened sounds and then this moment, I had my head in and was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed crying out, "Who's there?" And this is classic symbolist technique. We have the event, the moment, something happens, and now we have a stretched out contemplation or examination of the effect of that. So, and this is a whole hour. Right? I kept quite still and said nothing, and for a whole hour I did not move a muscle. It's hyperbolic to the point of ridiculous, right? And in the meantime, I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed listening, just as I've done night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. These are beetles. They're called death watch beetles, and they eat away at the wood, or the wood timbers of the house itself, of the building itself. And, I think the constant or repetitive allusions to time here take us to that broader thematic question of mortality and death. And Poe was fascinated with death. Well, you saw the bloody picture, right? The skeleton. But also terrified by it, and shared with so many people of his day a horror of being buried alive. In fact, you can research this yourself, but they had some coffin designs back in the 19th century where you had these sort of bell type structures that would push up above the earth. And the idea was that if you woke up and found yourself buried alive in a coffin, you could ring the little bell and somebody would come and dig you out. But that fear of morbidity, of being buried alive, I think takes us right to the end of the story where he rips up the planks as if ripping up the planks of a coffin for the body that's been buried inside, which is the old man he's just killed. Okay, so a slight sort of tangent there, but I think that's an important part of the story. In this moment, which actually lasts a whole hour, so it's not a moment, it's like a whole hour, we have the suspension of time. A suspension during which we have beating hearts. That's all. And then a slight groan. And I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. Not of pain or of grief, it was the low stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. This is Poe finding that residue of romanticism in him, because awe takes us to the sublime, as I said, I think in the first video. And the sublime is that encounter with those elemental forces of nature that just amaze us, that make us do that. It could be the tsunami coming towards us. It could be ultimately that moment's experience of death. Maybe it's that white tunnel we're supposed to go down. I hope so, please. And it takes us into the realm of the ineffable. Remember I was talking about Lacan? The abyss which is beyond language. So there they are. He was overcharged with awe, and I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. This is one of those moments in the text where people think this is suggestive of schizophrenia, of actually being one and the same person here. And now he's playing a game with the whole rationalization that we do, especially when we're trying to cope with our fears. All right? Oh, the old man's thinking it's just the chimney. Oh, that's what it is, just the wind in the chimney. It's a mouse crossing the floor. It's just a cricket which has made a single chirp. I think this is also an allusion to one of Descartes' moments in his discourses on method, where Descartes describes a guy waking up in the middle of the night, terrified by what's going on, the sounds. He's in a cabin in the middle of nowhere and seeing monsters and construing all sorts of things, and then trying to rationalize his way through it. So I think probably Poe is thinking about that. So he'd been trying to comfort himself with all these suppositions, but he'd found all in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. This enveloping, of course, is what is suggested by the watch inside the cotton and the man inside the bed and under the planks. So I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down. I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. And I opened it. You can't imagine how stealthily I did it, until at length a simple dim ray shot from out the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye, and it was open, wide open. And I grew furious. Again, the effect, the moment, and then elaboration on the effect of the moment. And again, more provocation to us. The narrator saying, have I not told you that what you think is madness is just over-acuteness of the sense? That's all I've got here. You think it's madness. It's not, he says. And now there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. And I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. And it increased my fury as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. And this sound becomes a hellish tattoo of the heart, growing quicker and quicker and louder every instant. And what we have here is textually, you could call it an amplificatio. Those of you who are musicians will know about crescendos, taking us to a climax. And so we have it here, and it's created by the repetitions. That's what repetition, one of the things repetition does in text. And so when he says the beating grew louder, we have it repeated louder. Notice now the return of the external environment, the external threat, because the thing that actually triggers the resolution of this, which is to say the murder, is the thought that all this sound, which is becoming a cacophony, is going to be heard by them, by the people outside, who represent the external threat here. So this is the new anxiety. The sound would be heard by a neighbour, and that's it. The old man's hour had come, and with a loud yell, so bang, there's the climax. I threw open the lantern and leapt into the room. He shrieked only once, and I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him, just suffocating him, enveloping him. And the deed is done. Although, of course, the heart beats on with a muffled sound, just like the watch inside the cotton. And his eye would trouble me no more. And if you still think I'm bonkers and mad, well, look at this. You won't think that when I describe how wisely and carefully I concealed the body. It was very rational, very controlled, knew what I was doing. I dismembered him, okay, fine, they cut off the head and arms. And then I just put him under the planks of the floor, right? I mean, it's clever, cunning, he says. 4 o'clock in the morning, all done, time to pour myself a drink. And, there's a bell sounding the hour. And then there came a knocking. So now we have, against this feverish rhythm of time that's been sort of manifest in the story, we have the outside, we have the clear, rational, segmented chronological time of the church bell. And I think that as a symbolist text here, we should understand that the plot development throughout this story is signaled by these interruptions of silence and by the different and increasing tempos and modulations and frequencies and loudness, pitches of sounds. That's how the plot has been developed as a soundscape. This is what makes it so very symbolist in its construction and in its recall. The external threat now penetrates the narrator's world because these 3 officers of the police enter his domain, enter the chamber. And a shriek had been heard by a neighbour during the night, suspicion of foul play, information lodged. And to begin with, the narrator, of course, is coming across as a rational actor here, controlling the situation, diverting them, relaxed, confident, no problem at all. But then look at how everything collapses at the end, because it's the sound which returns. It's as though he cannot now get rid of that elemental, pulsing, heartbeat sound, which becomes more distinct and ringing, and which is, if you like, the characterization or modulation of his guilt. And it becomes intense, vehement, furious. Look at the repetitions here, which are even extended now. Louder, louder, louder. You know, and the text degenerates into where it kind of began, which is in a frenzy of nervousness, a fever. It ends feverishly. And shockingly, but with a nice twist, yeah. And I think, you know, Poe would say, you're still reading? Did you read it to the end? If you did, if you remember it, if you're going to remember it tomorrow, if you had a bit of fun on the way, or you're kind of intrigued, or interested, then yeah, that's all it's about. In that sense, Poe, I think, is a precursor of aestheticism, that intellectual and artistic movement which develops towards the end of the 19th century as a kind of byproduct of Romanticism, if you like, into the early 20th century, the main idea of which was art for art's sake. And this is something that we will find central to Oscar Wilde's work when we get to it, with the importance of being earnest. But it's clearly central to what Poe is about too. All right, so now in the next part of this video, what I want to look at is, or begin to look at, is the work of Marcel Proust. We have a nice little picture of him again, which I gave you in the first video. And Proust is going to help us because of the way that he takes us from the amygdalal memory states that we've been focusing on so far, almost as a pivot, into those hippocampal, more episodic forms of recall that, if you like, take us into the next part of this course. So he's operating as that sort of pivot figure for us. He was very influenced by Henri Bergson, and Bergson's essay Matière Mémoire, which came out in 1896, in which Bergson differentiates or distinguishes two types of memory. So in the French, it's mémoire pure against mémoire habitude. But let's do this in English. So the first type of memory is involuntary or pure memory. And this is distinguished from voluntary memory, sort of day-to-day, more hippocampal, episodic memory. And we see this operating in Proust's text. And I think that it's fair to say that for Proust, it was the involuntary memory, the pure memory, which operated in his life like nuggets of gold. I mean, they were the valuable memories that we have in our lives, primarily emotional, and distinguished from the day-to-day guff that we have to deal with. And remember, like, where did I leave my keys, or you know, what am I supposed to do today, this sort of thing, which for him is more mundane and matter of fact, and in that sense voluntary, because we can actually say to ourselves, well, what do I need to remember, and exercise it in that way. But the pure involuntary memories literally just come out of nowhere, like springs. And his project, in a broad sense, and by project I mean the 6 books that make up his novel In Search of Lost Time, and of course that's a very revealing title, are really just an attempt to explore the access routes back into these pure nuggets of gold memory, these involuntary pure memories. He's just trying to figure out what the retrieval routes are, the best ways to do it. And this is the symbolist in him. He happens upon the olfactory and the gustatory and the tactile as the most likely, not convenient, but the most likely ways in which you're going to be able to find these pure nuggets of involuntary memory. I think just a quick look at one of, just an extract from him will help us here. So here we are, In Search of Lost Time by Proust, and this is from the first book, which is called Swan's Way. And he writes here halfway down, "Thus would I often lie until morning, dreaming of the old days at Combray, where he grew up as a child, of my melancholy and wakeful evenings there, of other days besides, the memory of which had been more recently restored to me by the taste, by what would have been called at Combray the perfume of a cup of tea, and by an association of memories, of a story which many years after I'd left the little place had been told me of a love affair in which Swan had been involved before I was born, with a precision of detail which it is often easier to obtain for the lives of people who have been dead for centuries than for those of our own most intimate friends, an accuracy which it seems impossible to attain, as it seemed impossible to speak from one town to another before we knew of the contrivance by which that impossibility has been overcome. All these memories, superimposed upon one another, now formed a single mass, but had not so far coalesced that I could not discern between them, between my oldest, my instinctive memories, if you like, the pure involuntary ones, and those others, the voluntary ones, inspired more recently by a taste or perfume, and finally those, the truly voluntary hippocampal ones, which were actually the memories of another person from whom I'd acquired them at second hand. If not real fissures, real geological faults, at least that veining, that variegation of colouring, which in certain rocks, in certain blocks of marble, points to differences of origin, age, and formation. So really, in this paragraph, he's just taking to us to these different variegated ways in which we can think about how memory works. And that's what we're going to see extrapolated upon or elaborated on in the extracts that we'll come to in the next video. But let's just think a bit about Proust and ask ourselves who he was, because I think that's going to help us with setting up the next video. He died young. I mean, he was 51 years old, died in 1922, and suffered with ill health throughout his life, although it's fair to say that he was also a hypochondriac and a neurotic, a famous neurotic. He struggled to form any long-lasting emotional attachments. It seems as though he was homosexual. He had one, it seems clear, relationship with Reynaldo Hahn, who was a famous composer of the day. But it seems as though that broke down. It was just very difficult for him to form relationships, and the only one consistent relationship he had was with his mother, and a relationship that many would describe as rather unhealthy. He actually wrote in a letter that, as far as his mother was concerned, he was never more than 4 years old. That's how she treated him. They would write little notes to each other, leave them outside their bedroom doors in the middle of the night. This was going on all day and night. They lived together constantly, pretty much. And there were weird little things about him. He writes about him there. He had these underpants. He couldn't sleep without these particular underpants, which were fastened with a little brass safety pin. And on one occasion, the brass safety pin went missing, and that was it. I mean, nobody slept. I mean, it was just chaos and a sort of mini tragedy until the brass safety pin was found. One of my favorite anecdotes is he went for a few days to Versailles, which is literally just a few kilometers away, miles away from Paris. And he came back and was bedridden, he said, for days afterwards. He wrote to all his friends saying that he was suffering from altitude sickness. But, you know, Versailles is 83 meters higher than Paris. I mean, that was enough to induce his altitude sickness. Extraordinary chap, really. And in the last few years of his life, he lived almost entirely in his bedroom, which he had lined with cork because the noises outside were driving him potty. So there he was, and so you have this vision of this guy on his bed in this cork-lined room, scribbling away these novels, or this 6-volume novel, I should say, on a little sort of, you know, rickety bamboo tea tray, and that's what he did. And when I first heard about that many, many years ago, I just thought, well, what a funny little man, you know. And he obviously was agoraphobic and a little bit weird or whatever, you know. And I was kind of put off the whole thing, and in particular, I was put off by the task of reading 6 bloody volumes. But I did. And by the time I finished, all I wanted to do was start again. That's how they affected me, how profoundly brilliant I found them to be. I think the first thing I realized is that what Proust does, what Ruskin does with water. Remember that essay we looked at last time, where he describes in this extraordinarily forensic detail in that essay the appearance of water and the painting of water and surface light and so on. I mean, what Ruskin does with, if you like, water in prose, Proust does with all the objects of the world around him and with human behavior. It is a forensic, extraordinarily detailed analysis of behavior. For some, it's too much. It's too much. I think one wit came across a sentence in his 5th volume, which, if you were to sort of put the words down in a row, would stretch for about 4 meters long. You know, because you just had a sense of it in this first extract. The sentences are just sort of compounded and compounded and compounded and compounded, and it can be a very, very long sort of exercise to sort of get to the end of it and figure out what's been said. And a lot of people don't want to do that. And happily for you, you know, you can escape with just a few extracts in one video. And that was also partly the reaction to begin with when he tried to get this published. I think the first, one of the first editors he sent it to said, "My dear friend, I may be dull, but I failed to see why a chap needs 30 pages to describe how he tosses and turns in bed before falling asleep." So, you know, and that's actually how the first volume begins. It's just these initial fragments that you have in your mind as you're between sleeping and waking. And Proust actually puts this in a page, and then it becomes 17 pages. And it's quite an extraordinary sort of waking up experience. In these novels, the narrator, who I think we can take to be Proust himself, takes us from these very earliest childhood memories to, you know, young adult, then mature adult, and so on, surrounded by people of all walks of life. He's connected, or becomes connected, to an aristocratic family called the Guermantes, and also to a Mr. Swan, sort of bourgeois character. But there are many other characters, lowlifes. I mean, he inhabits not just the aristocratic salons, but also the bordellos and the bars and the cafes of Paris. And there's nothing fawning or sycophantic about this analysis. He uses his forensic pen to beautifully display human behavior in all its hypocrisy. And he doesn't spare anybody, including himself, from that type of analysis. The running romantic theme in these novels is his attachment to Albertine. And in fact, 2 of these novels are to do with his very tempestuous relationship with her, all the jealousy it engenders, and so on and so forth. And I think we now understand that Albertine was, if not Reynaldo Hahn, then an imaginary male lover in Proust's own life. But of course, he was writing at a time when, as a homosexual, you had to hide that, basically, or fear for your life almost. Okay, so that kind of sets up who he was as a guy. And I think what I realized after reading all these books is that that funny little man sitting in his bedroom, cork-lined bedroom, for the last 4 or 5 years of his life, actually had a reason for doing that. And it wasn't because he was agoraphobic, and it wasn't because he was weird in that sort of sense. It was because this was where he realized he could live his happiest life. And he was happy because of the way in which he was finding it possible to recall the emotions that he experienced as a child and as an early youth. In fact, and we'll talk about this in the next video, but it's almost as though Proust comes to the conclusion that once you've had your first kiss, once you've had your first taste of champagne or whatever it is, all you can ever really do is replicate it. You can never do better than that. And so what if you could just keep conjuring up that initial experience, that initial emotional reaction? What if you could keep doing that? And if you can keep doing that and find a way to practice doing that, why do you need to go out? What's the point? Don't need to. I'm happy. I'm happy with my little tea tray and my texts that I'm writing, because of course, like Baudelaire, these texts were his vehicles, his depositories, his storage pots, if you like, for his memories. To conclude, this video is another video that I'm posting for you. And it's very short, it's like 4 or 5 minutes, but it takes us into that semi-seedy world of Paris in the Belle Epoque in the turn of that century, 19th into 20th century. And it's actually a dance sequence. It's contemporary dance to one of Erik Satie's gymnopédies, piano pieces. And Satie and Proust met each other occasionally. And it's an extraordinary rendition, I think, of absolutely beautiful and very, very impressive to watch these dances. And the basic premise of the video is that Satie had a brief affair with a woman called Suzanne, and it was very tempestuous and difficult. And the end, they had this very brief encounter, which was difficult. And this short film clip imagines him at the piano, imagining Suzanne with all the barmen and the prostitutes coming into the bar. Anyway, I mean, you don't have to, but I suggest you do. It's a fabulous 4 or 5 minutes, and it will kind of set up the mood and take us into the next video. All right, bye for now. See you then.